Hi, G. Michael Vasey with an episode of the Magical World of G. Michael Vasey podcast. And today I don't have a guest for you. Instead, what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about some work that I did many years ago with a friend, Sue Vincent, on the hexagram. And this all started out, I was basically doing the first degree course with the Servants of the Light out of the UK, a School of Esoteric Sciences, at the time under Dolores Ashcroft Nowicki. And I had already gotten about 4 years into the course and was communicating with some kind of inner contact whose name was Astaroth. And if you've read my book, Inner Journeys, Explorations of the Soul, I talk about how that occurred and how I met this inner contact and where that took me. And by the time I was writing that particular book back in 2005, I already was working on this messaging that I was getting from this inner contact. And this was taking the form of lots and lots of diagrams of hexagrams and a complete obsession with the hexagram. I did all kinds of research into the hexagram as a geometrical shape, as a magical symbol, as a glyph, anything that I could think of. But a lot of what I was playing with was coming through in meditation sessions directly into my mind from this supposed contact, Astaroth. And I started to write this down, and I did at the time, I remember, show it to Dolores when she was teaching a class or something that I attended, and she thought it quite interesting and suggested maybe that at some point I'd turn it into a book, which of course I did eventually. But I thought what I'd do was, again, take the approach of reading some of the material so you can get a feel for what was coming through. Certainly one of the big things that seemed to be coming through was about polarity. So let me pick up with a little bit of the book here and begin. But let us for a moment again consider the elements fire and water. Fire is like spirit. It is like a force, and in polar terms it is active. Consider the fire triangle with its single point facing upwards, and think about that superimposed on a man's body. The two bottom points representing the gonads and the simple upright point representing an erect phallus. Note also that physical fire burns upward, almost in the form of a triangle, and that heat rises. Fire burns, and in doing so it also transforms or destroys. Now consider the triangle that represents water. Water is a reflective liquid that has the power to dissolve. It is a form, and it is receptive. The water triangle superimposed on a woman's body would have the ovaries at the two upper points and the womb or vagina as the single lower point. Simplistically, when we combine man and woman in sexual union, and we are fortunate, the woman becomes pregnant and will eventually deliver a child. Symbolically, when the fire and water triangles are brought together in a hexagram form, another child is revealed, but this child is one that is not born of woman. On reflection then, the hexagram represents complete polarity. It represents polarity in all of its totality and in every direction, horizontal, vertical, and so on. In the center of that totality of all possible polarities, or in the center of the hexagram, is a hidden or perhaps unobvious seventh point, which is often overlooked, especially by those who simply tend to regard the hexagram as a satanic or evil occult symbol. Those that see the hexagram as a symbol of evil take their view from the idea that it has 6 points, and hence they believe that it represents the biblical 666, the name of the beast. Funnily enough, there is an insight in this too, which we'll revisit below, despite the fact that they have missed something extremely important. They have missed the fact that the hexagram actually has 7 points, not 6. For in the center of the hexagram, the symbol of utter harmony and balance is the 7th point. That point is at the very center of its symmetric axes and occupies the point of perfect balance and harmony. It occupies the place of perfection. The Pleiades, a group of 7 heavenly stars, have also long been associated with this concept in occult lore. In the book Comte de Gabalis, one will find the text of the 7 ancient prophecies of world peace, along with the author's insightful commentary. We read this prophecy with great interest as we researched the hexagram, and in particular found the explanation of a reference to the Pleiades extremely relevant. The Pleiades were 7 in number, 6 of whom are described as visible, and the 7th invisible, says the book. For the literalist, the hexagram's 6 points are indeed visible, leading them to the mistaken belief perhaps that this is a symbol tainted by evil because of the association with 666. But for those who contemplate this symbol in a deeper way and in the context of harmony and balance, the 7th invisible point is suddenly visible, and it is truly remarkable. One can also equate the 6 outer points of the hexagram to the 6 days that God worked on his creation in the book of Genesis. The 7th point is in the very center of the hexagram, signifies the 7th day of rest. Those who see this hexagram as a satanic or evil symbol only see the 6 days of toil and not the Sabbath, or the day of rest represented by that 7th point. They see the 6 days of action through polarity and not the day of rest in which those polarities are finally reconciled and the work accomplished. So you see, a lot of what I was getting about the hexagram was to do with polarity. Bear in mind I was living in Texas at the time, so the 666 and satanic references come from living around some very fundamental people who were pretty appalled at my interest in the hexagram at the time. I then went on to start to unpick different systems like Kabbalah, the Tree of Life, like the metals and the attributions there, like the planetary attributions and astrology. And I began to realize that the hexagram was a magical, mystical key that helped to unlock a greater amount of knowledge from those other systems. By laying the hexagram, for example, on the Tree of Life, and there's an entire chapter devoted to this in the book, you get to see how the elements are attributed to the triangles and to the lines that make up the hexagram as well as the Tree of Life, and by superimposing one on the other, much more is brought to the fore. The central 7th hidden point, for example, plainly is Tifereth. The other points can be attributed in the same way, and then the paths in the tree can be used to unlock much more value from the hexagram, especially when you start to include other things like planets and metals attributed to the different points on the hexagram. So I began to use the hexagram to, as I say, unlock different systems, and in particular examine the polarity implicit within those other systems. So for example, when looking at the Tree of Life and talking about polarity in the book, I said this: implicit in the Tree of Life, as in the hexagram, is polarity. It seems to us that polarity is often thought of as force and form, male and female, black and white, life and death, and so on. But this is only one aspect of polarity, and it is that aspect that is represented from left to right on the Tree of Life. It's horizontal polarity. The second form of polarity, represented from top to bottom of the tree, is from spiritual to material, from eternal light to the temporary darkness of night, and from the eternal to the temporarily constrained, i.e. vertical polarity. Let's consider that last idea in a bit more detail. Firstly, let's assume that Kita already exists, and let's discuss the Tree of Life in terms of developing an idea or a concept and turning that into reality. Kita is the source, but as the tree unfolds down to Malkut, things become more set in stone, more constrained by the rules that we created along the way. Yes, the tree contains an unknowable number of possibilities, but how does it actually work? Well, if one has an idea and sets out to turn that idea into reality, then we go through a number of steps. First, we have the idea itself, the eureka moment. But in order to have an idea, we must have some form of drive to think and ponder, and we must have some concept of turning an idea into more than an idea. So we're already through Chokhmah and Bina by the time we have the idea. We must be, since Chokhmah provides the desire to create and Bina provides us with the concept of forms. Without these, we can't possibly have an idea. since I simply am Kita. Let's imagine our idea is to design and build a house. We must first have the idea of a form of shelter, which we will call a house. This is my eureka moment, and it must take place in Chesed. As my idea gets further refined in all of its details, each is tested, thought through, considered, and it's either accepted or discarded, Gebura. And then as we go down the remainder of the tree, we are polishing, adding further details, and solving problems as they arrive. Finally, we have our blueprint for the house, Yesod, and must now take that blueprint and turn it into reality via a construction project, Malkut. None of this is truly a mystery, but the further into the process that we go, the more constrained our reality is actually becoming. When we started with the original idea, how our house could have been anything, made of anything, look like anything, and so on. But by the time we're complete, we actually have something, and that something was constrained utterly by the decisions that we made and the laws that we formulated to calculate issues like load factors, number of rooms, location of the boiler, and so forth. So our living reality is also constrained by laws. Those laws were created by the creator of that reality, and the reality is constrained to what it actually is. Free will was part of the process of moving down the tree, but in the end, the step between Yesod and Malkut doesn't really include much free will anymore, because we have so bound ourselves within our own constraints. As Astaroth said, there is consequence in action. That consequence is that as we create, we both constrain and limit our own creation. We create rules, laws, and formulations to construct something real and tangible on the material level. Which brings us back to the concept of time. In Kita, a point of being, there is no time. It is timeless and eternal. It simply is. It is simply I am. But as soon as we start to move down the tree, as soon as we create the idea of dimensions, our single point becomes a line between 2 points. One point becomes an unlimited number of points along a vector or direction. In other words, our being now has movement, and in having movement we must have a concept in which we can observe such movement: time. Time is therefore a construct. It is a constraint on which our reality is based. In actuality, time does not exist because I simply am. I simply exist. But in order to start the process of creation, we need a rule, a marker, an angle with which to experience, and that is time. Time is thus a basic constraint on our reality. The idea of creating something and needing to become more constrained in order to do so is perhaps nothing new. But it is a form of polarity represented on the tree of life. We call it vertical polarity by contrast with the other types of polarity, horizontal polarity such as black and white, male, female, etc., and what I call active polarity, that we usually think about as polarity. So going back to the hexagram, we've already observed that there's both horizontal polarity and vertical polarity, and of course that these axes of polarity neatly correspond to the lines of reflection in the hexagram that we discussed in the last chapter, where we discussed the concept of active polarity as well. On the tree of life, horizontal polarity is somewhat obvious, and we refer to the 3 pillars as the extremes of polarity: the pillar of severity and the pillar of mercy, and the balance in between. In a sense, vertical polarity is also referred to via the concept of the 4 worlds, which infer a process from eternal spark through to creation in a constrained physical creation as discussed above. Vertical polarity is from spiritual to physical. There is also a vague concept perhaps of active polarity because the tree of life is really a 3-dimensional structure and not a 2-dimensional diagram. But because it's naturally presented as a 2-dimensional diagram, the active polarity is often lost to us. Visualizing the hexagram as 2 interlocking pyramids, like the Merkaba figure, helps us to conceptualize the 3 polarities as horizontal and vertical plus depth. In a 2-dimensional representation, we observe only horizontal and vertical polarities, and we do not see the polarity offered by depth. When we place the hexagram upon the tree of life, these polar relationships come back strongly into focus. Horizontal polarity can be observed via the law of the triangle in our elemental triangles, while vertical polarity is observed via the as above, so below relationship. And that active or in-out polarity in depth, while still not as obvious, becomes clearer too. It is action and inaction. I also likened the polarities in much more detail and referred to them as cycles, or the three cycles. And I called those the cycle of potential, the cycle of action, and the cycle of creation. And by looking at those in terms of the sephira that were part of each of those cycles, I was able to extract a lot more value, a different perspective perhaps is the better way of putting it, of the tree of life. So I found that by using the hexagram as a key, one could extract different and additional value from other systems. As I said, I also looked at the metals and planets attributions. I looked a little bit at astrology and several other different magical systems. I then realized that throughout the entire time that I'd been working obsessively and compulsively under the guidance of this inner spirit Astaroth, that I had in fact developed a number of meditational exercises and visualizations, which also seemed to be working within the constraints of the hexagram as a magical or mystical symbol. And I outlined those in the book as exercises which I was hoping the readers of the book would take and perhaps give me some feedback on. In fact, what happened was that Sue Vincent did the exercises over a period of time, and she got some tremendous insights from them. And it was really interesting to see how well she did with those exercises. I'd love other people to do those exercises and let me know what kind of insights they achieve. I was then left with this very strange book, or half a book, and I didn't really know what to do with it. And as I said, I'd used Sue as a bit of a guinea pig. She'd volunteered to do the exercises and sent in a diary, like all good students do. And she said, well, look, why don't, maybe I could add something to the book. And I said, what a great idea. We can put this out together. And that's exactly what happened. She very kindly wrote the introductory chapter on the sort of associations of the hexagram through history. And then she also very kindly gave what is probably one of the most beautiful overviews of the Tree of Life I've ever read, which formed Appendix 1 in the book. So the mystical hexagram, the 7 inner stars of power, represents, for me anyway, the culmination of an obsessive 4 or 5 years where I literally could not stop drawing hexagrams and trying to deconstruct the hexagram into its components, its 4 elements, the cross, the circle, other symbols, looking at the angles, looking at the angular relationships, looking at the correspondences with different systems of meditation and magic. And in the end, it produced something that, if I'm really honest, I don't actually understand in parts myself, because it came to me in a way, I guess you would call it in modern world channeling, but it came to me from Astaroth, and I continue to get bits and pieces when I do my meditations as well. It continues to be something that's growing within my meditational state, but there are aspects to it that I don't yet fully understand, yet are written down in the book. The cycles, for example, although they make sense, I think there's a lot more that could be achieved in terms of looking at the cycles. Let me give you an example. Let's take the cycle of action. Just to give you an example, I'll read from the book. The second cycle is the cycle of action, which is observed in the line drawn through the hexagram from Gebura to Netzach. In Gabura we find the principle of active change. It is truly the engine room of creation, in that it is the great purifier breaking down anything that cannot truly be sustained. In Netzach we find our motivation and drive, our creative urge. The two are linked by Path 22, which helps increase spiritual powers, and Path 24, which helps provide an appreciation for creation. This cycle then is about the cycle of creation and destruction and its reflection in our own psyche. Again, both Gabora and Netzach, despite being on opposite pillars of the tree, are both attributed to fire. So you'll see there's something in that that's of value, and I think much more could be extracted, and I guess one day I will have a crack at working that further. In the meanwhile, the book has actually sold more copies than I ever expected and continues to sell, but the most important thing is I really would love to hear what people's experiences are with those exercises. And outside of Sue's diary, I've never had any feedback from anybody that's read the book. Perhaps they don't understand the book. Perhaps it reads like very strange material indeed. I don't know. But certainly, if you have read the book or if you're intending to read the book and you do the exercises, please consider sending me some feedback on what you got from it. Because today I still conduct my meditations in the same way. I still use the areas that Astaroth showed me for meditation purposes. So I still basically use the Garden of Remembrance. I still go to the Garden of Remembrance and the Circle of Healing, and I suspect that this was partly the point of the book coming through from Astaroth, was this particular approach to meditation and these particular locations somewhere in the universe where things were ripe for certain kinds of insights. Anyway, so the book, The Mystical Hexagram, The 7 Inner Stars of Power, is available on all Amazon sites, and if you do happen to read it, don't forget to give me some feedback. I'd love to hear what you thought, particularly if you do the exercises. Did you get anything from them? What did you think of it? Just drop me an email. So this is G. Michael Vasey saying thank you very much for listening in to this short episode. Hopefully we'll be back to the interviews starting with the next edition, which might be delayed a little bit because I've got my son coming over from Austin, Texas, and I want to spend a quality week or so with him. But in the meantime, thank you for listening. If you appreciate the podcast, please do like and share. It really helps. Goodbye.